It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning, everyone. We'll begin today at the intersection of this year's midterm primaries and 175 years of political philosophy. Ask a New Yorker what class they belong to, and you'll almost always get the same answer, I think, middle class. Right? The lawyer says it, the bus driver says it. Okay, Michael Bloomberg probably wouldn't say it, but for the most part, pretty rich or pretty poor, middle class is practically the New York and the American default. But the Democratic Socialists of America, the political home of Mayor Zohran Mamdani, want a lot of us to start saying something else. WNYC and Gothamist Elizabeth Kim reported this month that new DSA members are taught in orientation sessions to think of anyone who works for a living, whatever that means, as working class. Restaurant workers, firefighters, nurses, sure, but also people like doctors and Google programmers. Compared to billionaires, the argument goes, they're all in the same boat. Here's NYC DSA co-chair Grace Mauser when I asked her here on the show about that quote that she gave to Liz Kim. Did Liz get it right?
She did, yeah. I agree with what I said. The point I was trying to make with Liz is that it benefits billionaires and mega capitalists to divide people who are middle income or even lower upper income from working poor. When in fact, what we need to do to actually redistribute the massive wealth that the 1% holds is to come together as a broad working class movement and fight back. And in fact, historically, labor movements and large social transformations have often been led by relatively skilled workers who are facing deteriorating working conditions. I think this is a big reason why we're now seeing healthcare workers, even doctors, start to think about unionization as more and more practices are being bought up by private equity. It's why we're seeing educators, teachers who are, in some ways, white-collar workers, like thought workers, not manual laborers, lead union movements, why we're seeing graduate workers do the same thing. These are skilled workers who are facing just increasingly untenable labor conditions, and we're seeing them at the front of the labor movement for just that reason.
NYC DSA co-chair Grace Mauser here last week. Now, we should say not everyone buys it. The head of the city's largest municipal union, for example, told Liz that someone making $400,000 a year does not share the life experience or therefore a perspective with someone making, $18 an hour. And even the mayor asked to define the term in a New York Times interview last week, the term working class, said he hasn't asked where working class starts and stops. We will play that clip coming up. But this isn't just political philosophy in the abstract. It might actually matter to who wins elections and how New Yorkers and other Americans define ourselves. So we will begin today's show with the definitions, where they came from, how they've evolved literally since Karl Marx, and what this all might mean for politics in New York and for Democrats nationally in these current primaries and with the midterm general elections coming this fall. With me now are Elizabeth Kim, reporter here at WNYC and Gothamist, who wrote the story, and Chris Maisano, editor of New Labor Forum, a labor journal from the Murphy Institute at the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies. He's also a member of DSA, but not here on their behalf. So Liz, hi, and Chris, welcome to WNYC.
Good morning, Brian.
Good morning.
Liz, why did this question, who counts as working class, become a story on your City Hall beat right now?
Well, Brian, I will tell you that I first became interested in this question, not because of a local political figure, but one that I think a lot of Democrats and people who follow politics have been obsessed over in recent months, and that's Graham Plattner. Now, just to remind listeners, he was the former presumptive Democratic Senate nominee from Maine. He was forced to drop out this month because of sexual misconduct allegations. But prior to that, kind kind of what I saw at the heart, and other people have talked about this too, the heart of his rise to stardom was his identity. And it was his identity as this oysterman and him being this self-identified working class Mainer. And he himself talked about what it meant to be working class. And he had defined it in interviews. And one of them was actually a really lengthy interview he gave to the New York Times as part of their weekend podcast, the exact same forum that the mayor recently did. And he was asked about how he defines working class. And he said that it was as long as you were making your living from a paycheck, meaning that you're not making your living off a large stock portfolio or some kind of existing wealth, that makes you working class. And that just kind of really stuck and resonated with me. And I remember coming back to the newsroom after listening to that interview and talking about it with people. The way it reemerged was because of a New York Times story that Emma Goldberg did, and I really want to hat tip her on this. She wrote a story about how economic anxiety was driving surging membership in the DSA. And within that story, there was that bit about members who were being newly recruited and given an orientation and taught that anyone who works for a living can be working class. And in that story, she interviews Gustavo Gordillo, who tells her that a lot of tech workers are working class. We're trying to build a broad movement, and we think most DSA members are working class. And as soon as I read that line, I went to my editor and, we talked about it, and we said to each other, we have to unpack this. This is so fascinating.
Well, that's why Chris Maisano is with us as well, editor of New Labor Forum. But before we bring him in as the labor studies expert here, Liz, what's the point of DSA trying to define working class so broadly? Is this just political philosophy, or are they aiming for an outcome of some kind with this?
It's both. It's a political philosophy that is outcome driven. In a city where people are frustrated with the growing cost of living and feeling as if the life they want is out of reach, this expansive definition of working class, which I see is really about struggling, people who feel they are struggling. If that's this common sentiment, that's really effective for organizing and building a broad coalition.
So, Chris, for you as the labor studies expert here, you heard in the clip and in Liz's explanation the argument, the doctor and the waiter, same boat, because neither one is Jeff Bezos, basically. Is this the first time you've heard this? Is this new? I mean, we're going to do some references that go all the way back to Karl Marx and the actual Communist Manifesto. But in contemporary terms, is this new to you?
No, I wouldn't say that it's new. My own conception of the working class and who fits into it is very indebted, for example, to the work of the late Eric Olin Wright. And Wright was probably the preeminent sociologist of class of his generation. And for him, the working class consisted at a very general level of wage earners selling their labor power in the labor market. Now, of course, as we've just referenced a little bit, if you define it at that level of generality, that ends up being a very large group of people. And what that means is that there are many differences in experience that make a common class identity, as we've been talking about, across this very large group of people difficult to forge. So to list only a few of those sorts of differences that Wright and other people would have identified, we have the level and security of earnings, precariousness of employment, autonomy within work, skill levels and education required within work, the opportunities for creativity at work, the amount of supervision that you experience, so on and so forth. The list just goes on and on. So, while I think it's true to say that while most of us have to work for a paycheck to live, this doesn't therefore automatically translate into some sort of collective class identity or social solidarity. And that's the work of organization and political action. And that's what labor unions and political organizations and other groups try to do.
Yeah, but I could see just from your listing of those various criteria how somebody might flip and start identifying more as working class in those terms. Like, let's say the $400,000 software engineer, right, who all of a sudden feels instead of being on top of the world and, they went to engineering school or took a boot camp or something like that, and they're the ones who are so in demand that their job might be replaced by AI next year. And suddenly they develop these job security concerns and how they're treated by management, ownership concerns that they might not have had 2 months ago, right? So somebody could flip around conditions like that. Is that a good example?
Yeah, I think that is definitely a good example. To talk about our journal New Labor Forum a bit, we have an article that will be appearing in our fall issue where we talked to somebody who worked in the video game industry. So somebody with pretty rare skills. At one point probably enjoyed a fairly decent income and some level of job security, but with the introduction of things like AI and other changes to the industry, the level of precariousness that somebody like that experiences in that particular kind of field or that particular kind of labor market has really gone up. And yeah, people in that kind of situation can often find themselves feeling in ways that probably at the end of the day are not that different from somebody who, hasn't had the same level of education, hasn't necessarily had the same level of income or job security, is in a different kind of field. So I think, yeah, the sort of dynamic that you were laying out there, Brian, is definitely a real dynamic that people go through, and I think factors into some of these decisions that are made in terms of trying to approach people when you want to organize them, either into a labor union, a political organization, or something else.
Yeah, so in that example scenario that I gave, suddenly they become more concerned about benefits and severance pay and government benefits if they lose their health insurance or suddenly have no income. Listeners, you're invited in on this. Do you consider yourself working class? Where do you draw the line? Income, occupation, whether you rent or own, whether you have a boss, doctors, nurses, teachers, tech workers. Does your job feel more precarious than your salary might suggest, or does being working class ring false to you? 212-433 WNYC, 212-433-9692, call or text. And what about those of you on your feet all day, in kitchens, on loading docks, behind registers, who are obviously working class? How do you feel about sharing the label with a six-figure programmer or someone? And does it matter? Call or text us at 212-433 WNYC, 212-433-9692. And Liz, we should say here that you also did hear from people who reject this broad definition. I mentioned it in the intro, but Henry Garrido of DC 37, to go a little deeper here, told you someone earning $400,000 doesn't have the same perspective of somebody barely making $18 an hour. What's the case that he and others made to you, and why do they care what the definition is?
Well, he feels that there's nuance to it, and he believes that life experience matters. And the example that he gave me, which I thought was very compelling, was he talked about himself, because I actually asked him, how did he start up in the union? And he said he came up as a cafeteria worker where they did cafeteria inspections in Queens. And he said that, irrespective of the conditions, they had to show up. He said it would be 100 degrees in the summer, and they were there. They had to prepare 3,000 lunches. And he told me that when he was at that job, he had the opportunity to meet people who, in his words, didn't have a right to say, I quit. They didn't have a right to say, I quit because it's hot. I quit because, I don't feel well today. And that was because that job was the only source of income for them, and that they had others who were depending on not only that income, but also benefits, the possibility of a pension that job might bring. And what he argued to me is that's just not the same kind of economic desperation that someone who works at Google feels, because in his mind, someone who works at Google, maybe they lose their job, but they can go work at Microsoft. So it's about the number of economic opportunities that are available to different types of people.
So does that hurt the traditionally defined working class union member who Henry Garrido of DC 37 might represent? In a practical sense?
He acknowledges that, he represents, as you said, it's the largest municipal union in New York City, and he acknowledges that, he has a wide variety of members who make incomes across the spectrum. He has those cafeteria workers, he has parks workers, but he also does have people who do make six figures. And at the end of the day, they are, he is, as the head of the union, he is trying to keep them unified. But I think to him, these life experiences are an important distinction that he wants to be recognized, and that he is drawing the line in some ways.
We have a lot of calls and texts coming in on this broadening definition of working class that DSA wants people to accept. Let's start with Cindy in Jersey, in Long Valley. You're at WNYC. Hi, Cindy.
Hi, Brian. Thanks for taking my call. So I worked in the healthcare industry for a very long time, and it has shifted. And I wanted to say that for physicians now, especially young physicians, if you're making $350,000 a year versus what I made when I first started, $9 as a nurse's aide, there's a point where if you can't control your working environment, you do want to become unionized, because if you have to work 18 hours a day, anywhere from 12 to 18 hours a day, frequently 14 hours a day, and you have to pay for increasing malpractice costs, but you are becoming weary during your day, and your patient is at risk. This is the thing people don't talk about. If there's not proper staffing because the CFO, CEO, especially if it's a private equity firm hospital, doesn't want to put more physicians on, you're at a much higher risk for you and your patients. And then it becomes, I need to become unionized because of my working environment.
Yeah, really interesting example about doctors in particular there. Thank you very much. Cindy, great way to start off the caller section of this. But Joe in Astoria has a different take, I think. See, Joe, you're on WNYC. Hello.
Hi. I just want to say I don't identify as one of these people that, thinks that establishment Democrats are doing well for the city. So I don't want to act as if, I'm siding with that side, but I'm very critical of the DSA's efforts to try to water down meanings and identities. Because there's a very big difference between being working poor in New York and being middle class. Like, there are very real differences. And by just having this big tent strategy where we're all the same, it's actually the issues and the priorities of the working poor that are going to get lost in the shuffle. There are very big differences. There's some of us that have issues with NYCHA or that have issues with, poverty. That it doesn't matter to us whether there's bike lanes or there's outdoor dining. So you can't lump all of our issues in together. And when they do that, they kind of erase the issues and priorities of the people who are most disadvantaged and victimized by the system.
Joe, thank you very much. Chris Maisano, what do you think as a labor studies expert at CUNY of that critique? That if the definition is too broad, the people who are really making low incomes are going to get lost in the politics.
Yeah, I can see where the caller is coming from, for sure. But as I was saying before, pitching the kind of basic working definition here of what constitutes membership in the working class at that level is not actually, I think, an attempt to flatten people out or imply that there are no differences. I don't think that's the case at all. As I was saying before, just because two different people find themselves at some level facing that same basic condition of being reliant on selling their ability to work in the labor market to live. That doesn't mean that therefore erases any potential differences that they've got in their outlook or what is particularly important to them, or whatever the case might be. And if you've worked in, if you've been a labor organizer or if you've been a member of a union or something like that, that'll really come through. It's, members of the same bargaining unit in the same workplace oftentimes can't agree on, what it is that they should prioritize in their bargaining or for their contract, and things of that nature. So it's not really that there's no difference between the working poor or higher income workers or anything like that. It's that they basically have similar sets of interests, and that they need to come together to fight for the sorts of policies that can benefit people across the board, to the extent that that's possible. And also to address the other caller who called in about working in healthcare, I think healthcare is a really, really interesting example of this. And I think it points towards why, relying strictly on income or education types of definitions of who's in a class and who's not, it can tell you something, but it can often easily lead you astray. So, let's take a unionized registered nurse in New York City, for example. So that registered nurse, because in many cases they're going to have a strong union, is going to have a good union contract that has won them a pretty good salary. In some cases, that's going to get you a starting salary that's in the six figures, right? To get that job, you're also going to need a degree to get it. So if you leave out people with, pretty decent salaries or with college or even advanced degrees out of the definition that you're working with, you've done something like leave a unionized nurse out of your definition of who counts in the working class. And I don't know if we want to do that or if that seems to make sense for people. On the flip side of that, take a small business owner with little or no formal education and maybe not that great of an income, which is something that you'll find in any case, in many cases. So, if you're only looking at things like income or education, you might want to slot that person into, say, a working class definition. But would that really make sense in that person's case? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. So,
and here's a text from a listener who writes, the crux of this conversation is the inherent flaw in the language it relies on. Working class is a euphemism that belies the fact that a majority of labor happens at the bottom. We need new language. And Chris, almost nobody in this country calls themselves working class unprompted. That's probably not right. Many people do, but rich or poor Americans traditionally, and there's a lot of polling on this, say middle class. So historically, where did that habit come from, and what work is that phrase middle class doing?
Yeah, historically, that's a very strong tradition here in the United States in particular. You don't necessarily find that in many other countries that are at a similar level of wealth or income. And yeah, I think it really reflects our particular historical development and the sense that this is in some sense something of a classless country, that there's a lot of social mobility, and it's not supposed to be a country that where you're defined by the conditions of your birth. So the self-conception, I think, that many people have had over time as being part of the middle class is a nod towards actually that idea that there isn't a hard and fast class structure in the United States, that people can move up and can move down. So that I think that term of middle class becomes sort of a catch-all term that anyone can identify with. And, to a certain extent, I also think it reflects just sort of a basic sense that, like, being in the middle is kind of where you want to be, right? Being too high is not great. Being too low is not great either. You want to hit that golden medium, which is a concept that goes back all the way to ancient Greek times, if you want to take it back that far. I think.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah,
Finish the thought. Sorry. No, you go.
So in a sense, I think like identifying with middle class in a sense, is a way to kind of get at this concept of classlessness that I think has been really endemic to American society and culture really since the beginning for a very long time.
When we come back from a break, we're literally going to bring Karl Marx and the Communist Manifesto into this, starting with Paris and Brooklyn. You're going to be the next call because I see you want to bring Karl Marx into it. And then I know Chris has some thoughts as well as a labor studies professor. And we'll ask our Liz Kim what kind of reaction she got to DSA trying to redefine working class as anybody who works for a paycheck all the way up through doctor and tech programmer and et cetera, as we continue on The Brian Lehrer Show. Brian Lehrer on WNYC as we continue our conversation on the DSA's interest in very broadly defining working class as anyone who works for a living and not just the traditional categories of maybe restaurant worker, firefighter, nurse, but also people like doctors and software engineers. Compared to billionaires, the argument goes, they're all in the same boat. Our guests are WNYC's Liz Kim, who wrote the article on this, after hearing what's happening at DSA orientations for new members, and Chris Maisano, who publishes a labor studies journal under the auspices of CUNY, and Paris and Brooklyn. You're on WNYC. Thank you for calling in.
Hi, longtime fan, longtime communist. I think this conversation is a bit of a red herring without mentioning that the original definition of working class was made by Karl Marx, and that what had nothing to do with salary or wage or how rich you were. It had everything to do with who owns the means of production versus who has to sell their labor, whether that's their body or their mind, in order to make a living. So whether you're a doctor or a basketball player or a McDonald's worker or whatever, you're selling your body or mind to the people who own the actual economic system, i.e. factory owners, basketball team owners, people who can actually influence the economy, who basically control the economy and pass down that control to their children for generation to generation. So it's not about who's making what amount of money. It's about who owns the means of production and therefore basically control their entire society.
Well, as somebody who's obviously thought about this and defines yourself as a communist, what would be your reaction to this? Karl Marx wrote in the actual Communist Manifesto in 1848, the bourgeoisie has stripped of its halo every occupation hitherto honored and looked up to with reverent awe. It has converted the physician, the lawyer, the priest, the poet, the man of science into its page wage laborers. So he didn't say working class there. He said bourgeoisie. But it's almost like Karl Marx said in 1848 what Grace Mauser from NYC DSA said last month.
Yes, exactly. He's saying that they're all part of the same class of people, that, you know, these people that are highly skilled are selling their labor, and even if they're bourgeoisie, they're made into essentially wage laborers. I think he also talks about how the bourgeoisie is convinced that they're not the working class by the capitalists in order to kind of provide a moat between the working class, or like the poor working class, and the actual owning class. So, you know, richer people now, even if they are working class, are convinced that they don't have the same interests as poorer people. And that's why I think this DSA definition is important, because they actually are all in the same boat.
Paris, thank you for your call. We appreciate it. Chris, for you as the expert in the room, what's the difference, if you think there is a difference, between the way we're debating the word working class today or discussing it and the way Marx used the word bourgeoisie?
Well, first, let me say, you know, I grew up listening to The Fan in the car with my dad driving around. So, like,
sports
you know,
talk shows.
Yeah, so like being on the line here with people calling in is like dream come true for me. I feel like the Mad Dog, but like a much nerdier version of the Mad Dog.
I know there was a point where I think phrase, long time, first time, jump the shark from sports radio to here. But I'm
Yeah.
glad it did. So anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. Sorry, Brian, can you actually just restate your question? Me taking that little detour kind of scrambled.
Marx's use of the word bourgeoisie compared to how we're discussing the term working class today. Same or different?
That's a good question. So, in that context, when he uses that term bourgeoisie, he's mostly talking about the people, as the caller was saying, who would be owning and operating the means of production. So, what does that mean? That's basically a highly technical, somewhat abstract term to talk about things like factories, workplaces, the buildings, the tools, the implements, et cetera, that you would need to run a business, make a product, run an organization that sells a service, so on and so forth. So that's really the basic concept that he is employing there in that text, and which, not only socialists and Marxists who followed him would use it, but also people who would not consider themselves to be
that
socialists.
brings us back, I think, to the sort of gray area that you cited before, which is people who are owners of the means of production, quote unquote, but they're owners of small businesses, right?
So, I mean, one other thing that the caller was also getting into, and then also that you mentioned in the selection that you quoted, was that in the sort of economic system we have, there's a constant tendency to de-skill or to degrade or deteriorate the conditions that people live under, and that doesn't just go for people who are at, for lack of a better word, the lower rungs of the labor market, who may have less education, don't necessarily have like scarce skills that give them a leg up in the labor market, things like that. But, also apply to workers who may have some of those things. We keep talking, for example, about doctors. Doctors keep coming up here. And one of the big changes that have happened to doctors in particular is that some decades ago, doctors used to, in many cases, own their own practices, either by themselves or with a small number of fellow doctors, partners who would run this basically small business. What's happened over time, and the earlier caller who said that they had worked in the healthcare industry got at this a little bit, is with changes in that industry, at this point, a very large and growing share of that group of people are now employees. They don't run their own businesses. They're not bourgeois in that sense. They're employees in many cases of hospitals, and those hospitals, in many cases these days, are not independent. They become part of these large conglomerates, these large health systems that tend to dominate a market in whatever place they happen to be operating in.
Yeah.
So,
but, in the larger context of the United States, and Liz, by the way, thanks for your patience. We're going to bring you back in here in a minute as a City Hall reporter who focused on how DSA is trying to broaden the term working class, and we're going to play a clip of Mayor Mamdani that you brought. But, Chris, I read a history article recently that had Marx and Engels musing about why class consciousness and therefore socialist politics did not take hold in the United States in their day as compared to Europe back in the 19th century. And their analysis was largely about American sense of class mobility compared to Europeans. The American worker saw themselves as a potential small business owner and potentially prosperous down the road more than over there. Do you understand history that way at all?
In part, and another big thing that Engels in particular recognized in some very obscure letters that he wrote to German Americans living here was the fact of the West. People could go out west, set themselves up on a plot of land, so on and so forth, and that these sort of
physical
things
mobility.
would act as something like safety valves, letting off social steam, social pressure that might otherwise have blown up. Of course, that condition of the open frontier, et cetera, is long gone. Frederick Jackson Turner wrote his famous essay about the closing of the frontier. I think in the 1890s. So
Right,
yes,
and that's
I
the
think
physical frontier. And I wonder if the rise of the DSA right now is largely because that sense of economic mobility, the multi-generational upward mobility of what we call the American dream, is just objectively less available than it was in past generations. That capitalism is failing Americans in a not totally unprecedented way, because we had the Great Depression, but an almost unprecedented way. So Americans don't want government to own the means of production generally, and that's not what any DSA candidate, actual candidate around the country that I've heard is campaigning on, even if it may still be in the national platform on paper. But Americans do want more government intervention to guarantee a decent standard of living. I saw a story just yesterday. Here's the Washington Post version. I pulled this headline: Amazon and gig companies see spike in workers on SNAP and Medicaid, study shows. And it says Amazon workers on federal aid nearly tripled between 2020 and 2025, while ride-hailing and food delivery app drivers shot up on lists compiled by the U.S. Government Accountability Office, also getting SNAP and Medicaid. And this is a long question, I know, but it's that I wonder if the rise of DSA right now is largely because that sense of economic mobility, the multi-generational upward mobility of what we call the American dream, is just objectively less available than it was in past generations. That's not to say DSA necessarily has all the right solutions, but capitalism is failing Americans in a largely historically unprecedented way.
Yeah, I think that there's quite a bit to that. And I think that that sense is reflected in many things. But I think when we're talking about, if we want to talk about DSA candidates in particular and, their relative success at the polls recently, I think that really comes through very clearly in what is starting to be a very kind of recurrent thing that we're seeing in election results, which is a very clear gap, age split in the electorate around roughly age 45-ish or so, which is right around where I'm at this point in time. I'm not going to give you my exact age because it makes me a little sad. But we're seeing that time after time in election after election. And I think that, yes, if you talk to people who are turning out, voting for DSA candidates, who are joining a group like DSA, who are organizing labor unions at their place of employment, that's what they will tell you. And I think that's a big difference between people who are generally under that kind of age cut and those above it. People above it, I think, lived at a different time where owning a home in particular was much, much easier for them, even if, you didn't have a particularly high income, even if you didn't have particularly scarce skills, even if, you didn't have a higher education, so on and so forth. A big part of that, I think, is because some decades ago, we had a much higher rate of unionization that took in a much broader swath of the working population and therefore allowed them to fight for and win a larger share of the pie. Which allowed them to do things like buy homes and move up, as you put it. Today, with private sector unionization under 6% in this country, it's higher in a place like New York, but nationally it's under 6%. Sure. It's so much harder, I think, for people to do that these days, and I think that it's driving that sense of frustration, and I think it's making them look, to places that they may not have looked before.
So Mayor Mamdani himself got this question about how broad the definition of working class should be last week in an interview for the New York Times podcast, The Interview with Lulu Garcia-Navarro. Listen to how he handled it. This starts with her question.
How do you define the working class? Because there's also been a lot of debate around what is the working class now? And who is welcome at the table of the working class?
I think if you have to work to pay your bills, I think that is one definition of being a part of the working class.
So is that like anyone
sorry.
with oh my goodness, and it's okay.
It's just a bad cough.
Have you had it checked out?
I have.
Okay.
That's why I believe in Medicare for all. Everyone can check it out.
So that's everyone with a W-2? Is that kind of...
1099s too. I think it's. I'm less interested.
So someone making $250,000 a year is working class?
I mean, I haven't sat at home and asked myself where it starts and stops. What I would say is, for those who are working to try and afford the basic dignities of life and aren't able to do so, I think that is also a working class.
So Mayor Mamdani, who I gather is feeling much better by now, but Liz, for you as a City Hall reporter, what does that answer to Lulu Garcia-Navarro, who many listeners will recognize as a voice from NPR, now working for the New York Times and doing that interview? What does that answer tell you? Anything?
You know, he was asked about this again at a press conference on Monday. He was actually asked, do you consider yourself working class? And, you know, the mayor kind of joked, well, I consider myself the mayor. But he went on to say, you know, I think what he's saying to Lulu there and also what he said on Monday more or less matches the spirit of what the DSA has said about being working class. I think in his answer to Lulu, I would have said, you know, the dignities, someone who is trying to afford the basic dignities of life. I think that a follow-up is like, what do you mean by that? And I think he would probably say something like healthcare, childcare, you know, but I think that that's a question. How do we define what are the basic essentials that we as a society believe that everyone should be entitled to? You know, is it housing? You know, is it healthcare? I do want to bring back the conversation because I've heard a lot of, the caller who called this a red herring and a lot of people in response to my story saying, you know, why does this even matter? And I would like to bring us back to the other caller. I think it was Joe from Astoria who said to him it does matter because he feels that if we're not recognizing the people who live in public housing, for example, that there's a kind of erasure going on. You know, the way I think about it as a politics reporter is I think about how policymakers like the mayor is both a politician and a policymaker, right, have to make decisions based on a budget. The city has $126 billion budget, but even with the vastness of that budget, he still has to decide how does the city prioritize its spending. And I think one excellent example is, you know, the mayor wants to pitch free buses. There, on the other side, or it's not even two sides, but there is another alternative that people have talked about, which is the Fair Fares program. That is a program that gives discounted fares to people making a certain threshold of income, right? A percentage of the federal poverty line. And there has been, for years, this ongoing effort to expand that and make it more and more available to a greater percentage of people, right? And they did that just with this budget. But I think that that's where the conundrum comes, right? Should we spend money to make it free to everyone? That would mean, everyone from the waitress, the waiter, to the Google programmer. Or do we decide we spend less, but let's give it to people who make less too?
Right. And this is another political philosophy conversation that we're going to do a separate segment on, the means testing versus universalism debate. We just had Senator Andy Kim on the show this week, Liz, on his proposal for what he calls Medikids, to go with Medicare, right? And Medicare is so politically popular, we could argue, because it's universal for every American over 65. And he wants Medikids to automatically enroll every child born in the United States, and that might be more politically popular, I think part of his argument would go, than what we have now, the Children's Health Insurance Program or Medicaid with its particular qualifications that you need to meet in order for even a child to get benefits. So there's a political philosophy segment that we're going to do on that. But you did take this whole question of working class to Flatbush Avenue. Did the people you talked to see themselves the way DSA sees them? How did that person on the street segment of your reporting go?
Well, what's remarkable, Brian, and I agreed with what you said at the top, is that, I think, going into the interviews, my sense was that most people would volunteer themselves as middle class. But that was actually not what happened. I would ask people, the same question that Lulu asked the mayor, how would you define working class? And the person would most often go ahead and define their own lives. And it would be someone who was working multiple jobs. There would be someone who was saying, well, I'm part of the gig economy and I don't have benefits. And if I don't work, I'm basically not earning money. It would be someone who was just young in the city and trying to make it and trying to find their way and find a path to a career. There was even a pair of dentists that I interviewed, and the sense from them was like, well, in a few years, we aspire to be, I would hope to be part of the middle class, but that depends on whether I could pay back my loans. I think this sense
even though they own their own practices, right?
Yes, and I would say that what the common thread, it's this word that Chris brought up, which is precariousness, right? This financial precariousness that was, I thought, a common theme among a lot of people. And what was even more interesting is when I asked people to then define the middle class, that really stumped them.
Chris, last thought for today, and we could go on all day with this. Maybe we should come back to it and do some 4-hour special or something.
Oh boy!
But that means testing versus universalism debate. Do you, as a labor studies expert, have a quick take on it yourself? I mean, I was giving one of the political arguments for it. When something is universal, it tends to be more politically acceptable, whereas when something is for quote unquote the poor, then people start asking, oh, do they really deserve it? Are they just sloughing off and living off my tax dime? But an argument against it is, why should Jeff Bezos' kids be eligible for Medikids that everybody else is paying for, and that sort of thing?
Yeah, no, the way that you framed it, Brian, is exactly how I would tend to understand it. That's basic. Those are basically the terms of the argument. Both in terms of political strategy or expediency, but also kind of like the moral aspect of it, the question of desert. The only thing I would kind of add to that in this moment that we've got is it's also recognized that if you add means testing to a program, you therefore can actually increase the cost of it, at least to some extent, because now you've added additional administrative and bureaucratic requirements. People need to fill out forms. People need to determine whether someone's eligible to receive the program, et cetera. So, in that sense, a more kind of universal program that has fewer eligibility requirements and things like that is simpler administratively, can save some money in some respects. But I guess one other thing I would want to say before we wrap is that I think, in a lot of ways, this conversation that we're having over what it means to be part of the working class is really getting at something. And I think that something is that there's been a really significant recomposition of the American workforce and our economy's employment structure since the mid-20th century. And I think a lot of our mental maps and cultural conceptions haven't really caught up with that, with those changes. And those changes, I think, are defined at a very broad level by a big shift away from routine blue and white collar work that doesn't necessarily require much in the way of formal education, towards forms of work that are more professional or technical in nature, which require some degree of formal education, including higher education. And I don't think that this means that the working class has shrunk, although it certainly is the case that, for example, manufacturing employment in this country used to be 40% of the total workforce, and now it's down to only just about 8%. What I do think it means, though, is that the composition of what we think of as the working class has changed. And I think we're still trying to figure out what exactly that means. And I think that this conversation, this debate, is really a reflection of that.
Chris Maisano is editor of New Labor Forum, a labor journal from the Murphy Institute at the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies. And I'll say at the end, as I did in the beginning, he's also a member of DSA, but was not here on their behalf. WNYC and Gothamists Liz Kim wrote the article and did the radio report on DSA's definition of working class that they are advocating and discussing with new members at their orientations. Liz started this discussion with that piece. Liz, Chris, thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you, Brian.
WNYC's journalism and storytelling is heard by millions of passionate listeners. Sponsors of our programming gain our listeners' attention and their respect. Learn about how your organization can support WNYC and WNYC Studios at sponsorship.wnyc.org.